So Drew, I think we might be ready.
All right. I'll follow your lead, Noah.
Good morning, everyone who are following us virtually. My name is Noah Burke. I'm with the City of Santa Fe Land Use Department, the planning manager. I'm very excited to be here today. Today's going to be about our Midtown listening session for the planning of the Midtown campus. So with that, I will hand it over to Drew. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Noah, and thanks to everyone for joining today. Like Noah said, my name is Drew Finke. I'm with Opticos Design. We are one of the consultants working with the City of Santa Fe on the Midtown project. So thank you again for joining today. I'm also joined by Dina Belzer from Strategic Economics. She'll be answering questions as they come in on the Q&A, and then I will turn the presentation over midway through to Stefan Pellegrini, also of Opticos Design. So we'll go ahead and get things started here. Just a quick overview of what we'll be sharing with you in this presentation today. We'll provide a brief project background. Next, we'll look at what's happening now with Midtown. Then we'll share some guiding principles and ideas to help provide sort of a conceptual foundation for what we'll share next, which will be initial ideas for site frameworks for the Midtown site. We'll follow that up with some more ways to stay involved with the Midtown project. And then we're looking forward to saving time at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. And we'll be following that up with some polling questions as well. So we'd like to get feedback from everyone who's joining so we can get a better idea of what you think about some of the ideas that we'll share in this presentation. So just a note, we do have interpretation available in Spanish. If you click the interpretation button in your Zoom panel, we do have an interpreter standing by who can offer an audio stream in Spanish. We will have a designated Q&A time following the presentation, but if you have any questions over the course of the presentation, please feel free to submit using the Q&A feature in Zoom. Again, Dina will be answering those live as they come in, so please submit any questions you might have about the material we're sharing. So for anyone joining who may not be familiar with the Midtown project, I'll provide a quick overview of the project background. For starters, the project team is led by the City of Santa Fe and involves an interdisciplinary team of consultants. So like I said, I'm with Opticos Design. We're the land use and urban design consultant. Dina will be answering questions. She's a founder at Strategic Economics, who's looking at economics and development strategy. We also have Sherwood Engineers and Tool Design Group assisting with utilities, stormwater, and connectivity. And then Daniel Hernandez with Proyecto is providing overall project management with the city. So the Midtown project has been going on for quite a while. The Remike and Reimagine Central Santa Fe project started in 2012, and this involved St. Michael's Drive, which, as you know, is adjacent to the Midtown site. And then in 2018, there were some initial visioning exercises done for the Midtown site. So the ideas that we'll be sharing today build off of all of this work that's been done previously to try and move the project one step closer to implementation and to seeing action on the Midtown site. The 2018 vision process distilled sort of four guiding principles or pillars. Those are equity, looking at sort of social issues, economy, so thinking about how Midtown can generate prosperity for Santa Feans, environment, which thinks about natural resources, and culture, which considers how the history of Midtown can be brought forward even as change happens in Midtown. All of these sort of four elements are the lenses through which the project team thinks about the ideas that we'll be presenting for Midtown. In 2019, the city solicited proposals from private developer teams. These were submitted, and ultimately a master developer was chosen. As you all know, the last year or so has meant a lot of change in the world and in Santa Fe. So ultimately, the master developer that was selected didn't work out. At the end of the day, the arrangement posed too much risk for the city of Santa Fe. So that process was ended. Now the city is acting as strategic planner in moving forward with the Midtown District, which provides sort of more control. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a couple slides here. But I think a takeaway is that this process taught a lot of lessons in terms of what the private development community is looking for. And again, those are lessons that we're trying to pull forward into the work that's happening now. So speaking of what's happening now, we're still pretty early in the project process. So we're here where the star is. This week, we're wrapping up the public planning session, the workshop. That is following the listening sessions that occurred in July. And the big takeaway from this graphic here is that the way the Midtown plan is moving forward is that there are sort of two parallel processes, and there's a reason for this, but you'll see the teal arrow says community development plan. So that is looking at what I would think of as policy issues, and I'll speak to this a little more in a following slide. And then the orange arrow is the site development framework and land use. And that is what this presentation is about. And that is what the workshops this week have really focused on. Those are running in parallel. They'll inform each other. And as you can see in May and June, both of those processes will wrap up by delivering a final community development plan and then a final development plan with land use amendments. And both of those documents will be consolidated into the Midtown Master Plan. And that's what ultimately will guide development at Midtown moving forward. Following completion of that plan, the site itself could take up to 30 years to develop, depending on the type and intensity of development that takes place. So we'll be looking at finalizing these documents in May or June, and then it'll be 30 years from then that development and implementation happen across the site. So as I mentioned before, initially there had been a private developer proposal solicitation, and ultimately the city decided to take on the project themselves. Some of the decision-making that went into that involved what the desired outcomes for this project were. And by the city taking on the development planning process, it allows for a greater responsiveness to community concerns. It allows for the creation of a flexible framework that incorporates certainty where needed and allows for flexibility where that's desirable. And it provides for a greater degree of accountability as a public process being led by the city, which is a public entity. That contributes to a more inclusive process as well, because again, this is city government is responsive to the people, needs to be responsive to the people, and by putting the city in a position where they're able to guide the development planning for this, it allows for that accountability and inclusivity. So with the city leading the planning process, I think it's important to emphasize that the city will not be the developer, right? So the city is going to be working with community stakeholders and this consultant team, again, to create the two plans that I had mentioned on the schedule slide. That first one, the development framework plan, the one that I'm going to be presenting to you today in this presentation, and which we have exhibits to share at the workshop, that lays out the land uses and infrastructure framework. And the point of that is to enable development and future investment on the site. We talk about that being sort of a horizontal plan. So what I mean by that is it's all the things that sort of go on the ground. So your water pipes, electrical systems, streets, parks, and ultimately the land use. So that's different than the community development plan, which we might call vertical. And when I say vertical, it means all of the stuff that gets built on top of that horizontal framework that the development framework plan lays out. So the community development plan identifies the community benefit expectations that will be delivered as development occurs. So if the development framework plan sort of enables development to happen, the community development plan says this is what the development needs to deliver. At the end of the day, both of these plans work in harmony to enable private developers, nonprofits, and the city to deliver the development that the community desires at Midtown. This is sort of a reiteration of what I just described, but I think it's really critical. So I'll just move through this quickly. Again, the whole process is sort of two parts with one collaborative approach. That site development framework, it's systems oriented. It's about connectivity, open space, stormwater, and zoning. It's that horizontal element. And then the community development plan is policy oriented. It says what the developer needs to deliver. And that plan is where there will be direction on housing choice and affordability, jobs and career training, access to employment, community arts, land recognition and respect, and those different sort of policy level issues that will guide the type of development that happens. And there's ongoing engagement on those topics that I'll describe sort of at the end, how you can plug into that process. So the outcome of these two processes is a single master plan document that will respond to evolving market conditions. We want this to be something that is actually feasible. It will reflect community values, and it'll create a sense of place that's unique to Santa Fe. I think it's important to note that the master plan document will be a regulatory document. It'll be law, and it'll need to be approved by the Planning Commission and governing body in order for it to become regulatory. So some of the guiding principles and ideas that the consultant team has been considering have to do with a lot of the work that's been done prior to now as part of the Midtown process. So I mentioned earlier in 2018, there's the visioning process, and that demonstrated some community priorities that you see here. Some of those top priorities were housing and affordability, thoughts and concerns around inclusion, exclusion, and displacement, thoughts around opportunity and economic development, ideas about land use and zoning on Midtown, and then ideas about public spaces and community assets that could be community serving on Midtown. We've also heard a lot about the desire for sensitivity to sustainability and the environment. So one way that the project team is approaching that is to use standards in the lead for neighborhood development to guide the thinking that goes into these different policy and regulatory documents. So LEAD stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. This is a federal program through the US Green Building. And these are principles that guide the framework designs to allow for LEED certification if pursued. You can see on here what LEED certification means is really thinking about the environmental impact of development. So making sure that the type of development that goes in will enable sustainable lifestyles. So giving people options for walking and biking and taking transit, being very thoughtful about how stormwater is managed on the site, being very thoughtful about energy consumption through shading and orientation, waste management, water efficiency, reduction of parking. These are some of the different elements that go into this LEED certification. So again, this is sort of a lens that will help guide the thinking that goes into the regulatory planning for Midtown. I mentioned earlier that in July of 2021, we conducted listening sessions at Midtown and at the convention center. So what we heard from the community were some diverse ideas and concerns about Midtown. Some of those had to do with equity, so the community development access in terms of housing, access, public and community uses, a desire that development could build and strengthen local capacity in communities. In terms of the environment, again, there was conversation about green buildings and sustainable infrastructure at Midtown, a desire for smart growth and connectivity that again would allow for more efficient and sustainable transportation choices, attention to stormwater management on the site, and looking at how development and community design could again reinforce that environmental priority at Midtown. In terms of economy and economic development, people talked about the need for job creation and access, especially for adjacent communities. The idea that Midtown could potentially provide some job training or employment for those surrounding communities, and thinking about how future planning efforts could sort of catalyze economic development that would be supportive of existing communities in the area. In terms of thoughts about culture, there's a desire to maintain a memory of place. So we know Midtown has had a lot of different uses and activities and institutions that have taken place on this land, a lot of different inhabitants. So a need to acknowledge that place, to hold a memory of that place, to maintain a physical character that helps to hold some of that memory. Also a desire that Midtown could be a citywide cultural destination, and that the community programming that would take place at Midtown could support that citywide destination. Also in 2018, a series of visioning plans were created by a variety of local teams. So these laid out visions and concepts for Midtown, and they provide a really important opportunity to learn about some of the thinking that has been done for the Midtown site. So we'll get into this in a little more detail later, but on the screen here is some analysis of those plans that's looking at sort of the big framework moves, because that's sort of where we are in this process now, that we're thinking about frameworks in terms of, again, street and block layout, infrastructure, open space, and stormwater. We're not yet at a point where there have been any decisions made about what those would look like, and we're not at a level to consider building placement yet. So this is showing, again, sort of that higher level framework, and it's doing that analysis on those 2018 vision plans again, so that we can pull forward some of those really important and good ideas, so that as the plan and vision for Midtown is refined, all of this thinking, all of this visioning isn't lost, but it's pulled forward into what we're looking at now. Similarly, the 2019 private developer proposals, which you see on the screen here, had a lot of different and interesting and really valuable ideas about how Midtown, how the site could be used. So again, we're looking to pull some of those forward to integrate the good thinking and the best practices into the refined plans as we move forward with that development framework for the Midtown site. We also looked at Santa Fe and New Mexico precedents. So again, one of the things that has been consistent throughout the process, and which we certainly heard very clearly during the July listening sessions, is the desire to really think about how Midtown can reflect a unique sense of place in Santa Fe. So we took a look at the street and block patterns in Santa Fe, at sort of plaza traditions across the state of New Mexico, and looked at how acequias and arroyos have impacted sort of city form in the region. So within Santa Fe, we were curious how the city's urban form contributes to a sense of place. So what we started to look at is the block patterns in downtown Santa Fe. This is characterized by what we would call sort of offset intersections. So in some newer development, you might typically have sort of a four-way intersection, but what we see a lot of in the more central parts of Santa Fe is that many of the intersections are T intersections, right? So they are sort of three-way intersections, and what that does is it helps discourage cut-through traffic, and it also creates a unique sense of place, because as you come down a street, if that street ends in a T intersection, you get a very particular view of the building at the end of that intersection. This isn't something that you see in cities across the United States. This is a pattern that is unique to older cities such as Santa Fe. You also see a pretty big variety of block sizes and dimensions, which again sort of adds to that unique sense of place. And then in terms of the open spaces, the parks in Santa Fe, what we noticed is a distinction between a more formal civic space, such as the plaza, and a more informal, natural civic space, such as what you see along Alameda Street. So these sort of set up a framework by which we can understand how block patterns work in Santa Fe to create that unique sense of place, but also the relationship to the type and the design of open spaces, how that contributes as well. We looked at plazas from across New Mexico, considering things like the orientation. So what sort of sunlight does the plaza get? The ratio of the length to the width. Is it more square or is it more rectangular? Santa Fe's plaza, which you see in this upper left-hand corner here, is sort of, it's close to a square, but it's still rectangular. So we thought about the size and then also what we would call the degree of enclosure by adjacent buildings. And what I mean by that is if you look at the Santa Fe Plaza up here in the upper left, the black shapes you see on the image, those are buildings. And you can see that the Santa Fe Plaza has buildings on all sides of it, right? That almost creates what you could think of as sort of a big outdoor room. And that's very different than something like San Miguel de Vado, which is in the second row. It doesn't have a lot of buildings around it, so it feels much more open and you don't actually get that sense of an outdoor room like you do in Santa Fe. We also took a look at acequias and arroyos to better understand how those interact with urban form. And by urban form, I mean the way that blocks are laid out, the way that the buildings are laid out. And what we see is that arroyos are more natural, they're less structured, and typically blocks sort of change their shape to match the arroyo. And that's very different than an acequia, for example, which is man-made and can better follow sort of the existing street and block network. So again, like we saw sort of a more formal and informal civic space with the plaza and the linear park along Alameda, we see a similar pattern where arroyos are much less formal, acequias are more formal. So that thinking helped us to sort of understand how to approach the Midtown site. So all of those precedents and background ideas were meant to sort of provide a foundation so that as I move on to share our initial ideas for site frameworks, it's sort of clear where some of the stuff is coming from. So it's not things that are sort of just being pulled out of the sky. All of this is meant to have been informed by the past thinking, the community input, and then these local and historical precedents. So when we started looking at Midtown, we wanted to think about how it could be part of a district. So we thought of it in terms of where Midtown fits in within Santa Fe, the relationship to the Midtown Link, and I'll explain what that is here in a couple slides, how Midtown interacts with adjacent neighborhoods and adjacent properties. So looking at Midtown sort of within the context of the whole city, we see that it's connected to these different centers of activity and centers of importance. So the Midtown site is denoted with this yellow star here. You can see that that is immediately adjacent to the Seiler Road area where there's some ongoing economic activity, and with Meow Wolf, we see some employment being generated in that area. To the east, it's connected to St. Mike's, which again is an important connection to the rest of the city via the highway, but it also has economic activity happening there. Going north to south, we see some destinations near Zia Road along the Rail Runner station. Similarly, along Cerrillos is the South Capitol Rail Runner station. And then up at the top, you see the Rail Runner route ending at the rail yard, which is adjacent to downtown. And then the blue circles to the east is the hospital, which again is an important sort of citywide destination and employment center. Each of these circles are showing a half-mile radius, which is typically considered the furthest that people might choose to walk. So that's obviously going to be impacted by things like street network and topography. But in generally what this shows is that Midtown is sort of well positioned to both support and be supported by these adjacent areas of economic activity in these adjacent destinations within the city. There's sort of an opportunity to think about how these regional destinations can be connected and how Midtown can be connected to that. But also how a citywide multimodal network could support connectivity. So these green lines that you see here are showing either existing or planned bike routes. So it's possible to start thinking about how all of these different centers of activity can be connected through ways that don't exclusively rely on a car. Zooming in to Midtown along Cerrillos and St. Michael's, we have the Midtown Link. So this is the Midtown Local Innovation Corridor Overlay District. And this is a regulatory tool that's meant to incentivize residential and mixed use development in Midtown and along St. Michael's. It's meant to encourage walkable design, and it includes the Midtown Site. So the design thinking that goes into Midtown needs to be compatible and be able to work with the existing design thinking and existing regulatory structure that's gone into the Midtown Link. This is, again, an opportunity for the Midtown Site and the Midtown Link to sort of work with each other and actually reinforce and strengthen each other. Zooming in a little further, we can think about the opportunities that Midtown provides to address some of the concerns of adjacent neighborhoods. So Midtown is obviously a major site within Santa Fe. It can be a really catalytic project that can start to think about how these other challenges around the site could be fixed or at least addressed by some of the thinking that goes on for Midtown. So through the course of the project and certainly during the July listening sessions, some of the concerns we heard from adjacent neighborhoods had to do with access to and through Midtown. So an understanding that there are really valuable cultural facilities on the Midtown site and a desire to be able to access those from adjacent neighborhoods, whether that's getting to those facilities, whether that's accessing future jobs or educational facilities that might be located on the site, accessing the library, or even just thinking about how it can be made safer and more convenient to cross Cerrillos on foot if you're trying to get to Midtown. We also heard a desire for better access to parks and open space. So that means both access to existing open spaces, such as Franklin Miles Park, but also a desire to see new open spaces on the Midtown site that can serve adjacent neighborhoods. We heard concerns about traffic, so how development on Midtown could add to existing traffic loads on adjacent streets and in neighborhoods. Concerns about noise that might be generated from activity on Midtown. Concerns about displacement, how development on Midtown could affect and impact affordability in adjacent neighborhoods. And then also thinking about flooding impacts, particularly to neighborhoods to the south of the Midtown site during storm events. So all of these concerns are ideas that we want to be very much aware of moving forward. Again, the Midtown site and the Midtown development is really an opportunity to address some of these concerns and actually improve quality of life for people living around the site as well. Zooming in even further, we want to acknowledge that the Midtown site is surrounded by a variety of other property owners. So the Midtown site itself is owned primarily by the city of Santa Fe. To the north along Cerrillos and St. Michael's, the adjacent property is owned by private property owners who are being engaged and consulted as part of this group to sort of understand how any plans they might have could help and be helped by development at Midtown. To the south and west, state of New Mexico owns lands, the United States Forest Service. There are some other adjacent or non-contiguous city of Santa Fe properties. And then to the east and west, the Santa Fe Public School District owns land as well. I should also note the Schelleberger Tennis Center at the south of the site is under private ownership as well. So part of the discussions and ongoing thinking about how Midtown could develop over time are involving these different landowners to understand, again, how plans they have could impact or be impacted by what is being considered for the Midtown site. So jumping in to some of the concepts, the sort of core of what we're looking to share with you at this presentation, again, I wanted to lay a little bit of a foundation for some of those. So one of the things we thought about looking at the site is the surrounding systems that development at Midtown could plug into. So when I say systems, what I mean by that are the trails and bike networks. So how can people get to and from Midtown using something other than their car? looking at regional and local roadways. So understanding how people will be accessing Midtown if they do choose to drive, understanding transit lines, sort of the opportunity to connect any future residents or visitors or workers at the Midtown site to the transit system. And then thinking about nearby schools and how access to those schools, both for any future residents and for existing adjacent residents in adjacent neighborhoods, could be improved and made safer through development at the Midtown site. So that question of access that came up so much during some of the listening sessions, what we approach that by thinking about big picture principles for how connectivity could happen through and across Midtown. When I say connectivity, I mean that in a very general sense. So we've heard from a variety of stakeholders who say, I want to be able to walk across Midtown. I want to be able to bike to and between Midtown. Some people say they want to drive. But when I say connectivity at this point in the project, what we mean is some way to get from point A to point B within or through Midtown. So the lines on this page are really about connections. That could mean it's a street that includes bike lanes. It might just be a pedestrian paseo, or it might be a pedestrian and bicycle path. That has not yet been determined at this point. But the big picture connectivity principles in terms of east-west connectivity, look to better connect Midtown to Hopewell Man and to create a connection between Hopewell Man and General Franklin Miles Park to provide better access to open space that already exists in the region. We see an opportunity to provide access to the transit that exists today along St. Michael's Drive. There's a need to provide good internal connectivity within the Midtown site. This can help to reduce traffic by not funneling all traffic onto a single route. We've heard a lot of desire to prioritize people walking and riding their bikes over vehicles within Midtown, and a real need to minimize cut-through traffic to reduce impacts to adjacent neighborhoods. We can then layer over that some thinking about connectivity that moves northwest through the site. So some of the principal thinking behind that is looking at how Midtown can be connected to the Acequia and Arroyo trails that already exist, how those north-south connections can provide better access to transit along Cerrillos and Siringo. Again, thinking about how good internal connectivity can reduce overall traffic. Again, thinking about how to prioritize pedestrian and bicycle traffic as it moves north-south through the site. And again, thinking about how to minimize cut-through traffic. And that can be done both in terms of how the streets are laid out, but also in terms of how the streets are designed. We can then layer on some thinking about open space and the principles that guide that thinking based on earlier work in the project is a need to provide a variety of interconnected civic and open spaces throughout the site. So really thinking about open space as a system rather than individual spaces that might not really acknowledge one another. Instead, thinking about how a central open space or plaza can be used for community gatherings and events, how that could complement an open space that celebrates the natural features. So again, when we were looking at downtown Santa Fe, we saw that really formal plaza, and then we saw the much more natural linear open space. So the takeaway from that is a variety of open spaces can really serve residents well. And that's what some of the thinking is here in terms of this overall open space principles. And again, just to reiterate, thinking about how existing open spaces such as Franklin Miles Park can really be part of this overall Midtown open space system. Along those same lines, thinking about stormwater as a system can help to provide a better outcome for the site in terms of its impacts to adjacent neighborhoods. So by thinking about it with a comprehensive approach, it allows us to use low impact and green infrastructure approaches. By doing that, those stormwater facilities can also become amenities that actually make Midtown a more pleasant place to be, that can help to green the Midtown site. And by integrating the street network and the open space network with the stormwater system, it allows for greater efficiency and again, provides the opportunity to create amenities out of those stormwater facilities through things like rain gardens, things that are going to really help to beautify the site while also performing a very necessary function for stormwater management during storm events. So if we look at all of these as an integrated system, we can start to see how these work together at Midtown to provide a comprehensive approach that is both effective and that provides co-benefits. So each of the slides I've just shared list different principles having to do with connectivity, having to do with open space and stormwater. But when we think about those in a comprehensive systems way, they can work together to produce a sense of place that is going to be much more complete and much more thoughtful and intentional than if those are considered sort of independently. So what you see here is meant to demonstrate what those principles could start to look like. I'd emphasize again that at this point in the project, this is still conceptual and this is still a framework. And what we mean by a framework is sort of a series of ideas overlaid on the site. What this isn't is a development plan or a street plan or an open space plan. These are all concepts. And part of the point of putting those concepts over the site is that it allows us to start thinking about other sort of practical considerations that will help to inform what a plan ultimately looks like. One of those is phasing. So which part of Midtown will get built first, which part of it will get built towards the end of the development. And one of the things that we've started thinking about is a focus on 5 early start projects, how existing infrastructure can be leveraged for short-term development. So this is thinking about how the stuff that's already on the site, already in the ground, can be used for first phase development. Thinking about how future development would follow any additional infrastructure or connectivity investments. Generally, that means that development would start in the east, where the existing infrastructure is the most robust and in the best condition, and that as investments are made to put new infrastructure in, that would push development further west on the site. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, we want to consider how flexibility and incremental strategies can allow development to better respond to any changes in the market or any changes in what the community needs and expects from Midtown in the future. Because again, this could be a 30-year process. So we don't want to lock anything in that would render the project sort of infeasible or undesirable in the future. I had mentioned the 5 early start projects. These are projects that the city is undertaking based on the direction that's been provided by the community over the past many years that the Midtown conversation has been happening. And these can be thought of as sort of anchors for the Midtown site that again can help to start informing how phasing would work and how an ultimate development plan would look. The first of these is to rehabilitate and reuse the Fogelson Library Complex as a public library and community learning and innovations center. So the city will be working with the library department to undertake an assessment of the existing facilities and determine what sort of investments would be needed to open that facility up to the community as a public library. Another step is to identify initial parcels for the development of mixed use, mixed income, affordable housing on the site. Again, this is one of the early start projects. So wanting to figure out how an early phase development at the site can incorporate that mixed income affordable housing. Looking at how new city government and community services can be located within the Midtown district. The intention here is to move government services closer to people in the center of Santa Fe to make it easier for Santa Feans to access the government services they need. The city has begun to market and identify an experienced partner to expand the operations of the Midtown Garson Studios. So consistent with the thinking for this project over many years has been an integration of film and media production on the site. So this is a first step in starting that process. And then the 5th item is to rehabilitate and reuse the visual arts complex. And this is meant to provide a community arts and culture hub on the site. And again, this is consistent with some of the top ranking priorities for the site over the years to see continued sort of cultural production happening on the site And this is really meant to make sure that that can happen from very early on in any development process that occurs. So as we think about how phasing can sort of build on Midtown's existing strengths, I had described a little bit about some of the principles that could guide that. And this is what that could start to look like. So if you remember earlier in the presentation, we saw those 3 panes that showed the connectivity, the open space, and the stormwater. This layers all of those and starts to show some initial ideas for how development could happen across the site. In the short term, again, it's the idea of using the existing facilities that are already working well on the site. Those might take some investment to upgrade those facilities, but it would mean that the existing buildings that are being reused as part of those 5 early start strategies, again, could be sort of anchors for new development that could occur primarily on the eastern and northeastern corners of the site. This could be something as quick as 5 years from when development starts. Moving into medium term, which could be between 10 and 20 years, we see that additional infrastructure investment and additional connectivity investments could open up the remainder of the Midtown site to development. And then long term, so again, looking 25 or 30 years into the future, we see an opportunity to engage with adjacent property owners and partners to open up additional development sites around Midtown. So as Midtown builds out, as these new open space facilities open, as the cultural institutions open, we think there could be a lot of value for these adjacent properties owned by the state and by the city to transition their uses to uses that would be more complementary to what's happening on the Midtown site, to allow the people who might live and work in those spaces to take advantage of some of the amenity on Midtown, and again, to help support any small businesses or any mixed use activity that might be taking place on the Midtown site. Again, I think it's important to note the rightmost pane is a long-term vision. It would involve cooperation with those adjacent landowners. So these are early conversations that the city is having, again, to sort of understand what those adjacent landowners might be looking to do as Midtown develops. So the following sketches start to illustrate how some of the phasing concepts could play out. And they're really meant to give an initial idea for how the scale and space created by new development could look and feel on the site. So what this is showing is it's a view looking towards the Fogelson Library Complex. You see the view is taken from a pedestrian paseo that could be limited to pedestrians and bicyclists. There might be new development on either side of that, which would frame the view to Fogelson. And again, this idea is that in the first phase of development, that'll primarily happen in that northeast and eastern part of the site. So there really is a lot of opportunity for the new development to be synergistic with existing facilities such as the Fogelson Library. In phase 2, we talked about how additional investments in infrastructure, open space, and streets could open up more of the site to development. This is showing a bicycle route running east to west, sort of integrating with a new plaza space. The building in the background here is Benilde Hall. So that's one of the buildings that has been identified as a building that should be preserved because it has many functional years left in it. It's a good candidate for reuse. So again, this idea of phase 2 is that new civic spaces and new infrastructure could sort of anchor development. And then in phase 3, as more connections are made external to the site, there's an opportunity to expand the stormwater system into a more district-based system. So what this is showing along the street is an idea about how rain gardens and again, green infrastructure can serve as amenity, help to green Midtown, and help to create a really unique sense of space. That sort of set of tools could work at any point through the development at Midtown. But as we get to later phases, the opportunity for those to be more district serving, to work as a larger system, become more feasible. Another of the questions that the Midtown Master Plan will be answering is the type of uses that would take place on the site. Some of the principles informing that thinking are to create transitions between uses and intensities of development, to focus on opportunities for residential uses on the site, to create opportunities for film and media expansion beyond the existing footprint of the Garson Studios, to provide for some degree of mixed use development to encourage walkability, to maintain civic and institutional uses. So these are things like the Fogelson Library, the Garson Theater, SFAI, and then to provide flexibility for changes in the market. So what you'll see on this plan to the right is an initial idea for how different use classifications could fit into the connectivity framework that we discussed earlier. You'll notice that many of these zones are suggesting some degree of mixed use, again, to provide for the flexibility and to encourage walkability, because we know that mixed use environments make it easier for people to walk to destinations. And you'll see along the south of the site a fairly substantial footprint for the film and media use. Again, I mentioned that these frameworks are really about providing an opportunity to start testing out ideas, and that has to do with phasing. It also has to do with development capacity. So what I mean by that is the connectivity framework and the infrastructure framework that's been suggested we'd need to understand what type of uses or how many residential units that framework could support. So what we started to do here is to look at different building types that could provide both housing options on the site and flexibility. So these different types are not looking at, is this affordable? Is it rental? Is it market rate? We chose these because they're pretty flexible and they could work really for any of those scenarios. But the primary goal here was, again, to think about what's an appropriate development intensity for the site and sort of what's the right number of units or of non-residential space that, that Midtown would need to accommodate. So in order to do that, we looked at buildings that were between 2 and 3 stories. So across the top here, you see small courtyard housing and townhouses. And then we also looked at buildings that were between 4 and 5 stories. These larger buildings might have parking structures that are sort of within the building or might be underneath. These are things like the large courtyard building or mid-rise. And a note for the smaller 2 to 3 story buildings, you can see the idea for the parking there is that that might be surface parking or it might be tuck under. So in the small courtyard housing, you see garages along one side that might back up to an alley. So those lower heights allow for sort of a different approach to parking than what's required as you get into taller buildings. We looked at these in order to be able to test out some different capacities for the site. So we took some of the thinking about the frameworks that I'd shared and populated those with some test buildings to understand if the site was built out between 2 and 3 stories, we think there'd be capacity for around 900 residential units and about 200,000 square feet of non-residential space. At the other end of that spectrum, if the site were built out exclusively at 4 to 5 stories while maintaining the existing buildings that have been designated for reuse, that would yield a capacity for around 2,500 residential units and around 500,000 square feet of non-residential use. I'd point out again that the residential units that we're showing here don't differentiate between for sale or for rent or affordable. The idea is that those different housing types could work in any of these scenarios. It's really just a question of how intense the development would be. If you look in the middle between those two ranges, if you have a mix of buildings between 2 to 3 and 4 to 5 stories, there's capacity on the site for around 1,700 residential units and 350,000 square feet of non-residential use, in addition to the film studio uses. And again, the idea here is to start to understand what an acceptable range would be for the community, what they're looking for on the site, so that as we move forward with a Midtown master plan, we're able to gauge the required infrastructure investment accordingly. So those are the ideas that we have to share with you all today. Some quick notes on how to stay involved. If you'd like to learn more about these ideas or talk with the consulting team or the city project team, I really urge you to come speak with the project team today at the Higher Education Center on the Midtown campus. At the same time, Chainbreaker will be conducting a bike giveaway and bike repair. So another great reason to come out to the Higher Education Center today. We'll be here until, someone will be here until 3 p.m. And you can see on the screen here some photos from yesterday. We started out at the Higher Education Center yesterday. All of the drawings and ideas that I've shared on this presentation will be presented on posters, which you see here. We're inviting people to come, let us know what you think, leave a comment with a Post-it note, talk with the team. And then in the center of the room, we've got a 3D model. And the point of that, again, is to take these framework ideas and to start testing out what sort of building capacity those can support or that would be desirable. So you see here in the black tape that's showing where some of those streets could happen. The orange tape is showing some pedestrian and bike connections. And then we've got a ton of small building pieces that we can start moving around the site to understand where is more intense development appropriate, where is less intense development desirable, and how can the location of those buildings start influencing the sense of place around open spaces, around those pedestrian paseos. So again, invite you out to the HEC until 3 p.m. That's the Higher Education Center on the Midtown campus. Beyond today, there are still plenty more ways to stay involved. So on the screen here, you can see some upcoming events. There will be continued drop-in hours at the Santa Fe Art Institute on the Midtown campus, and then Voices at Midtown, which is a virtual and interactive presentation that's conducted over Facebook Live. There'll be a Midtown bike tour on October 16th and a Midtown block party, October 23rd through 24th on the Midtown site. If you're interested in some of the policy questions that I had mentioned before, you'll remember that I said that this presentation was really focused on the development framework, the sort of horizontal items, and that there is the other piece of this, which was the community development plan, the policy side, the vertical side. If that is something that's interested to you, I'd really encourage you to attend these events because that's going to be the primary focus there. So if you want to talk about affordable housing, economic development, cultural programming and preservation, land acknowledgement, site history, these are great opportunities to do that. So I would really encourage you to find one of these times that would work for you and stop by. We're also asking people to fill out a post-event survey. So if you stop by Midtown, you can pick up a survey and do it there. You can also visit this website and let us know what you thought of this presentation so that we can improve and better communicate going forward. And following that, I'd like to open things up to a Q&A. So again, Dina, who's in the room with me here, has been answering questions as they come in. So please submit any questions or comments you have in the Q&A now, and we'll get those answered. And what I'll suggest is that we would like to move on to the polling portion of the presentation, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't enter in any questions. The Q&A is going to remain open, so we'd invite you all to submit questions as you have them. And I'll get started here with our first poll question. So again, thinking back to some of the concepts that I had shared around connectivity, we'd like to know what you think about that. So I'm going to send out this initial poll, and then we'll leave that open for about 45 seconds to provide an answer there. Again, thinking back to those north-south connectivity principles, east-west connectivity principles, some of the thinking about cut-through traffic, prioritizing pedestrians and cyclists, and then thinking overall about how connectivity can happen in Midtown. Encourage you all to let us know what you think here. We've got about 20 more seconds in the poll. All right, thanks for everyone who participated there. I'm going to move us on to the next topic, which is open space. So similarly, I'm going to open up the poll for about 45 seconds. Let us know what you thought, thinking back to those ideas about different types of open space, about thinking about open space as a system, using existing open spaces like Franklin Miles Park, better connecting those, again, to create sort of a district-wide system of open space for Midtown for any future or existing residents or visitors or people working there. We've got about 20 seconds left in our poll, so let us know what you think. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll here. I'd remind everyone that you can also visit the Midtown website. Let us know what you think there if you want to provide more long-form feedback. The point of these polls is really just to do sort of a quick temperature check, see how people are feeling about what we've just presented. There'll definitely be some opportunity for additional feedback through the website. And then, of course, if you come out to any of those events. Now thinking back to stormwater, we'll have this poll open for, again, about 45 seconds. So thinking about the principles that were discussed in terms of integrating stormwater with the open space and street network, using low impact and green stormwater facility design, making sure that the stormwater impacts to adjacent neighborhoods are well managed, actually seeing opportunity to improve those impacts by creating better facilities than what exists today on Midtown. We've got about 15 seconds left in our poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that one out. Move us to our last question here. And this slide has a bit of an error in it. Apologies for that. The question that we want to ask you is really about the phasing. So the poll that you're going to see pop up here is going to have to do with site phasing. So we talked about using building off of existing infrastructure and existing strengths as part of an initial phase to deliver some sort of early development that can really start to address those community needs and concerns quickly. And then expanding development as additional investment is made in infrastructure and connectivity. Let us know what you think about that. We have about 20 seconds remaining in the poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. Looks like we've got some folks who are a little unsure about that one. So that's really helpful for us to know. Again, thank you for sharing that. We understand that this poll is a pretty simple way to get at some of these really complex issues. So appreciate that. Let's see here. Sorry, everyone, my slides are a little out of order from what I expected here. So apologies about that, but thank you all for participating in the poll. At this point, I don't have anything else to share with you all. So I want to thank you for your time. Again, our Q&A is still open if there's anything anyone would like to add, but otherwise, again, thank you, and would really encourage everyone to visit the Midtown website, share with us any comments or feedback you might have that is sort of more detailed than what fits in the poll. Again, this is the site. You can go to midtowndistrictsantafe.com and let us know what you think. And I'd also encourage you, if you have a comment on your mind right now, feel free to drop that into the Q&A. It'll still get to us that way. If you'd like to think about it a little bit longer, again, come out and see us at the HEC today, or drop it in on the website. So we'll hang around a bit more in case anything comes in on the Q&A, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining today. Really appreciate your time, and again, encourage you to make it out to any of the ongoing events as you're able. So thank you very much. All right, for everyone still on, we're going to wrap things up here in about 1 minute. So if you were sending us a comment via the Q&A, please try and send that as soon as you can. Want to thank everyone for joining, and would share with any of the panelists that you are welcome to sign off. So thank you. And shout out to Leilani for providing our interpretation services today. Thanks so much for staying on and being available for that. We really appreciate it. All right, so with that, we are going to sign off here. Again, thanks to everyone, and this will be available on YouTube as a recording. So